Really, the last one I did, the lengthy one, was on the Peter Thompson book, which was highly slanted, I think. It was very well researched, but highly slanted.
Slanted in what way?
Terribly anti-Pakistani.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Too much.
Okay, we're rolling. Okay, we're rolling. Make sure I'm rolling too. I think so. I'm stopped. Dr. Cogan, thank you for inviting us here this morning.
You're quite welcome. It's a pleasure.
We named our last book about Afghanistan Crossing Zero. It has a literal meaning because the Durand line separating Afghanistan from Pakistan is known as the zero line. But it was intended as a metaphor for where we are right now as a country, and some would say as an empire. Zero line is the mirror, the place where you meet yourself and you either reflect on what you've done and who you are, or you step into the mirror and become the other. Since 9/11, there hasn't been an awful lot of reflection. Milt Bearden, in an interview many years ago, after the War on Terror began, stated something to the effect of, now we're just having a war on terror without stopping to reflect on why we're doing it. On April 24th, 2009, in an appearance before a subcommittee on the House Appropriations Committee, Hillary Clinton admitted the U.S. had aligned itself in Afghanistan with forces that have grown into an existential threat. Afghanistan was the pivotal event of the Cold War, and the ramifications seemed more ominous by the day. But long before Hillary Clinton's reflection, before 9/11, and even before Afghanistan, there was another organization setting the stage for Afghanistan that was beyond congressional oversight or even presidential control. According to John K. Cooley's book on Holy Wars, 1999, quote, the Carter team adopted a method of avoiding the stigma of direct CIA involvement in covert operations which could go wrong and backfire on the United States. It was a method Henry Kissinger had refined and applied with skill. Get others to do what you want done while avoiding the onus of blame. The others, in Kissinger's era of the early 1970s, a time of rehearsal for the approaching adventure in Afghanistan, were a set of unlikely colleagues and allies called the Safari Club. The Safari Club player who was probably helped most to draw the U.S. into the Afghan adventure was Count Alexander de Marachez, chief of French external intelligence from 1972 to 1982. So the question is, from the outside, we can't possibly know all the pieces of this very complicated puzzle that brought us to where we are today. Could you speak to the issue of outsourced intelligence raised by groups like the Safari Club in the run-up to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan?
Well, I think, I know Mr. Cooley and I have respect for him, but I think the Safari Club had virtually nothing to do with the Afghan adventure. We were aware of it, of course. We were in touch with Count de Moranche, and we knew of the existence of the Safari Club, but it wasn't a player in that sense. The main action took place between the Pakistani ISI, that is the Pakistani military intelligence, and the CIA. And it began really with the assassination of the American ambassador in Kabul in April 78? February 78. Yeah.
February 79.
And this there was a botched rescue operation. The Soviets were coaching it, if not participating in it. And this incident ripped the relation between the Afghan government and the U.S. The communist government had taken over in Kabul just before that, around that time, right?
It was the communists had taken over on April 29th, 1978.
1978. And so the relations were strained, not only because it was a communist government outside the Soviet bloc, which was unheard of, and because of the incident with Adolf Dubs, the ambassador. So it was a strained relationship. So now we come into 79, and we have a very close relationship with the PAC-ISI, and it goes way back because the U-2 spy plane was produced and created by the CIA, and in this famous skunk works out in California. And the takeoff point for these spy flights was Peshawar. And we had to coordinate with the PACs. Now, it's a little unusual for the CIA to be in touch with a military intelligence organization. Usually that's left to the U.S. military. But in this case, the ISI was in charge of arrangements at Peshawar. And so that led to a liaison with the CIA station in Islamabad. So from there began this relationship that went on for years and years and years between the CIA and the ISI. Despite the fact that the political relationship with Pakistan was rocky and has been rocky from the start, with ups and downs, and really a sort of a raspy relationship, because Pakistan is a country with a grudge. It's a country that considers itself aggrieved. And anything that goes wrong is blamed on the Americans. At any rate, the ISI-CIA relationship held. And at the time of the, we're talking about 78, 79, it was headed by a very impressive guy, a Pashtun from Herat, General Akhtar, who was very close to Zia, President Zia. And the ISI is a semi-independent organization. General Akhtar had a direct relationship with Zia. They didn't have to go through the army hierarchy. It was Akhtar and Zia. These are the people who ran the Mujahideen operation. And Akhtar, with whom we were in constant contact, of course, came to us in the I think it was the late spring of 79, and said that there was a revolt in the countryside against the Taraki regime, Taraki being the prime minister of the communist regime. And would we help them? And so in July 79, President Carter signed a finding in which the CIA was authorized to provide non-lethal aid to the ISI for the rebels in the countryside. And this consisted of propaganda materials and non-lethal equipment. And this lasted until the end of the year, 79, when the Soviets became suspicious of the man who had replaced Taraki in a coup in, I think, September 79. His name was Hafizullah Amin. Now, Amin had a background with the Asia Foundation, which was a CIA front. He was not a CIA agent, but this made the Soviets suspicious. Also, Amin started reaching out to American and other Western diplomats, and this also made the Soviets suspicious. So after Amin had engineered his coup against Taraki and later had his men smother Taraki with a pillow and kill him, the Soviets decided to get rid of Amin. And they sent in a plane with special forces, Spetsnaz troops, killed Amin in his mountaintop palace and installed a member of the other faction of the Afghan Communist Party. Amin and Taraki were from the Khalq faction, which was more of people of military background, and the other faction, which the new prime minister brought in by the Soviets, who was in exile in Russia, Babrak Karmal, he was with the Parcham faction, which was a more of a urban-based faction. So at that point, I think this took place on the 26th of December, and within a day or two, President Carter signed a new finding authorizing lethal aid. And at that point, the CIA, which of course is a very streamlined organization, sprung into action, and the first shipment of Enfield rifles arrived on the 10th of January 1980, which is very fast. And, well, the rest is pretty well known. There was a gradual build-up of lethal weapons. The idea was to provide Soviet, except for the Enfields, which was a common item in Afghanistan, the other equipment was to be Soviet equipment, so that the myth could be preserved for reasons of plausible denial that these weapons had been picked up from the battlefield. And they mainly were RPGs, rocket-propelled grenades, and machine guns, and Kalashnikovs. And this constantly escalated with the arrival of Casey as CIA director. Things were stepped up even more. And then, of course, there was the introduction of the Stinger, which was not a Soviet weapon, and the CIA was a little hesitant about this, but our friend Charlie Wilson, among others in the Congress, pushed this very hard, and by '86, Stingers arrived in Pakistan. In Afghanistan, and had a devastating effect over the next few years. I think the total is something around 1,000 Soviet helicopters were downed, not necessarily by the Stingers, but also by the RPGs. There's SA-7, the Soviet missile. At any rate, this had a devastating effect, and the Soviets left in February '89. The last soldier left. And unfortunately, at that point, the CIA sort of stepped away from things, and by then the Afghan Prime Minister, Najibullah, showed remarkable staying power. Of course, he was supported by the Soviets in terms of equipment, and he hung on till '92, when he was captured and executed, taken away from the UN compound, I believe, and hung. So that's sort of a capsule of what I recall from it, but I'm happy to answer any of your questions if I can be of service.
What I'd like to do, thank you, that's an excellent capsule of the events for those 10 years. What I'd like to do is I'd like to go back and take some of those individual events,
Sure.
bit by bit, and kind of examine them, bring some other information in that you may or may not be aware of is available out there today.
Okay.
I know that it's a big world, and there's lots of things out there now that were not available to lots of people,
Okay.
and have been for the last 20 years. What I'd like to do is set the stage politically for what was going on after Vietnam, 1975, 1976. And what I'm driving at here is I'd like to understand how you, as an executive in the Central Intelligence Agency, was able to parse between some of the political decisions that were being made that were not necessarily what you wanted to do or felt was wise to do on behalf of American interests during that time period. And we'll eventually work our way to Charlie Wilson's War as one of those things. But there's a sequence of events that were going on, and this is a very interesting historical time period in the United States at the end of Vietnam.
Sure.
1976, there's a number of things that are happening. Team B experiment in competitive analysis, driven by neoconservatives. Paul Nitze, Richard Pipes, Richard Pearl, clearly with an ideological agenda. Civilians with a political agenda challenging the Central Intelligence Agency by politicizing intelligence, which was a serious issue. It had begun, at least during the time, I'm sure there was always an issue about politicizing intelligence, but it came to a head during the Nixon-Kissinger years. As I recall reading that John Paisley was pressured at one point to politicize intelligence, and was sent on sabbatical for a year to London, to a military academy in order to apparently understand better protocol. When he came back, he was assigned the task of being the liaison between Team A and Team B. This would be in 1976. Carter is elected on a peace platform, but he brings in Zbigniew Brzezinski as National Security Advisor. Zbigniew Brzezinski is known to be a Russophobe, well known in his writings. Stansfield Turner, CIA Director, disparages the Team B findings, but Brzezinski advances their political agenda inside the White House. Brzezinski has a long reputation. He is a strange pick for advancing détente. Paul Warnke, in an interview that we did with him in 1993, referred to Brzezinski as a neoconservative, but a whole lot smarter.
I wouldn't quite agree with that.
Well,
I would never call him a neoconservative. He was hostile to the Soviet Union, yes, but not as a neocon.
not as in,
In fact, today, Brzezinski is on the right side of just about every issue.
today he is.
Yes. In fact, I had an exchange with him. Should I recount this?
Yes, please.
This was at the funeral ceremony or the reception for Sam Huntington. Brzezinski was there. I'd never met him before. And I went up to him and introduced myself, and I said, I agree with everything you're doing and saying, except for one thing. You gave an interview to the Nouvel Observateur some years back, saying that we sucked the Soviets into Afghanistan. I said, I have never heard or accepted that idea. And he said to me, you may have had your own perspective from the agency, but we had a different perspective from the White House. And he insisted that this was correct. And I still, that is obviously the way he felt about it, but I didn't get any whiff of that when I was Chief Near East South Asia at the time of the Afghan war against the Soviets.
There was Robert Gates, in his book, From the Shadows, 1996, I believe, stated that the issues, he starts the section in his book by stating that it was early in 1979 when his staff began debating whether they should, quote, create a Vietnam situation, or Russia's Vietnam, for the Soviets.
Well, as Brzezinski said, you have your perspective, and we had a different perspective from the White House. Now, as Chief Near East South Asia, we were not at the political level of U.S. decision-making, although we were in very close relationship with state, particularly during the Iran hostage crisis. I was in almost daily contact with Harold Saunders, who was my counterpart in the State Department. But that's still, it's not at the high political level of the White House. So I can accept what Brzezinski said, but it's the first time I'd heard of it, and I was surprised when I read it in the French magazine.
So you really think that he knew more than you ever were aware of, or being made aware of?
Yes, and what you say from the Gates book corroborates this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess my question following this information was kind of doing what you have to do, and you're having to deal. I know the Israelis have stated this in the last couple of years about it. The neoconservatives stated it, making facts on the ground. If facts are made and you're not necessarily aware of all the aspects of these things that are happening, but you're responsible at the CIA for dealing with them and having to advise the president on what to do about these things, how do you weave back and forth? What was your impression of the Team A, Team B conflict as it was going on? Because that percolated from 1976 politically all the way through 77, 78 until the summer of 1978 when Zbigniew Brzezinski convinced Carter to shift control of the Central Intelligence Agency from the State Department to the National Security Council.
Could you hold the thought for 1 minute while I make a small adjustment?
Yeah, sure.
Please.
Off your computer.
Right.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the Shah because I want to say something about Iran.
Right.
Okay, the camera is rolling. Thank you very much, and I apologize for the interruption.
Well, as a point of clarification, the CIA has never been under the State Department. Never. It has always been, since the National Security Act of 1947, under the President and, by extension, the National Security Council. But this leads to all kinds of ambiguities out in the field because the ambassador is supposed to be in charge of everything that goes on in the country. But there's an exception to that, and that is in the 1947 Act, the CIA is supposed to protect sources and methods. So the ambassador cannot know the sources and methods. But in practice, since he's, we're taking now the example of Afghanistan, since the covert action in Afghanistan is supervised by the 303 committee. They had different names, included state and defense. So he's sort of aware of what the covert action is doing. But the point is, the CIA is in essence an independent agency, although under the ambassador in the field, but it has its own communications, which the ambassador does not see. But the ambassador is supposed to see the finished intelligence, not necessarily before it goes out. So it's an ambiguous relationship, and it's much better working now than it did in the past. But it's paradoxical in many ways.
Do you think it was vulnerable to being politicized, the intelligence that was coming back and forth?
I never detected that, except in the case of Iran. It was clear that the Shah didn't want us to be, that is CIA, to be in contact with the opposition. And I think the ambassador, was Helms, and then it was others, Sullivan, they sort of went along with the Shah's wishes. So we really, with some exceptions, notably a State Department officer named Matrinko, we didn't have contact with the Iranian opposition, as we should have. So that was an example, if you will, of politicization, because we were deprived of these contacts because of the relationship with the Shah and the Iranian intelligence, the Savak. But other than that, I never detected any politicization of Afghan intelligence, intelligence on Afghanistan. Never.
I have to move my camera back because I think you blocked me.
Stop it. This camera is now rolling, yes?
I wanted to add a further point about this relationship between the station chief and the ambassador. Every new administration which comes in is followed by a letter from the president to the ambassador saying, you're in charge here, you run everything. And in one case, which I won't specify, the ambassador called in the station chief and said, in the light of this letter, I want to see everything you send. And the station chief didn't say anything, but he didn't follow the direction. So therein lies the ambiguity of the situation. Now, as regards Team A and Team B, we really weren't terribly aware of this because, there's this Washington jargon, stovepipe. The area divisions in the CIA are cultures of their own. Although, of course, much of our mission abroad was to try to recruit Soviets, that's true, but we really were not aware of what was going on in the Soviet world to the extent that, of course, the Soviet division was. So there's sort of a compartmentation. There's very little cross-fertilization between these area divisions. They're all little empires in themselves. Anyway, that's what I wanted to add. Yeah.
That's very good. I like the word empire. You know, one of the things that you know, when you go to Afghanistan, a place like Afghanistan, and you get in there and you discover that as a Westerner and in our case, bringing camera crew in, that you have a lot of power in a place like that. You have a lot of influence. We spoke with the Time magazine correspondent, Rob Schulteis, who had been in Pakistan with the Mujahideen back through the 1980s and marched over the hills. And he had a completely different perspective than we had because we'd gone in from almost a diplomatic level with Roger Fisher and with CBS News and Nightline. But he said, going in with a budget for guns or whatever, he said, in a tribal culture like that, a warlike tribal culture, he said, up in the mountains, he said, you could do just about anything you want. He said, you can create any kind of situation that you're looking for. So I think that's what you're saying is really very interesting in terms of the amount of control over what you were doing.
Well, you know, the Near East South Asia Division, which I was the chief of from 79 to 84, we used to call it the Division of Kings and Presidents because the CIA station chief in many of these areas had a big role. It's very different in Europe. CIA station chief is just a functionary. He's not in the political level of dealing with the chief of state or anything like that. It's different. Near East Division, Far East Division, very much sort of proconsular type of role that the CIA station chief has. So where do we go from here?
Yeah, okay. 1977. Stansfield Turner purges roughly 400 Vietnam-era agents from the Central Intelligence Agency. That provokes an outrage response from America's neoconservatives, not to mention the 400 dispossessed agents. At the same time, Brian Crozier, British, Information Research Department of the Foreign Office, in London, sets up a high-level independent covert organization called the Sixth International. In his memoir, Free Agent, in 1993, Crozier writes on page 134, 135, quote, "The stark fact was that the entire security apparatus of the United States was in a state of near collapse. One of my best sources told me he was summoned by CIA Director Stansfield Turner shortly after he took over under President Jimmy Carter in 1977. My friend was one of some 400 CIA Soviet experts fired by Turner. The question was whether something could be done in the private sector, not only in Britain, but in the United States and other countries. I proposed the creation of a private sector intelligence agency beholden to no government, but at the disposal of allied or friendly governments for certain tasks which, for one reason or another, they were no longer able to tackle. Crozier already has groups like the Safari Club and other groups doing undercover work in the Middle East and Eastern Europe. Question: you couldn't interfere directly in Afghanistan prior to the presidential finding, but the British could, and apparently did. That's what these private intelligence groups were created for. What did you know about the British and their activities?"
Well, we had a very, very close relationship with the British. They were playing their Athens to our Rome. They were very knowledgeable. I have great respect for MI6. We met with them very often. They always wanted to get in on the act. They're great at ingratiating themselves. They wanted to get this blowpipe missile introduced. I think they were able to in a certain way. Also, they had ground truth, historical ground truth in Afghanistan. They were in touch with Massoud in a way that we were not. Although in the later incarnations of CIA station chiefs, particularly Milt Bearden, he did have some contact with the Afghan Mujahideen, but otherwise, the Pakistanis preferred that we do everything through them, which was largely done, because we didn't want to. The CIA was very conscious of possible Soviet intervention, either bombing the refugee camps in Afghanistan or even crossing the border, or otherwise interfering in Afghanistan in retaliation for what we were doing, which although it was supposedly under plausible denial, it was an open secret that the CIA, with the Saudis, was aiding the Mujahideen movement. As I said, we had direct contact with, of course, with General Akhtar and with Zia. Every time Director Casey came out to Pakistan, he met with Zia, and usually there was the military chief, General Arif, was there. Of course, General Akhtar, the Pak Foreign Minister Yaqub, and we would meet in Zia's bungalow. And Casey was very impressed with Zia. And the first time he met him, he said, "You know, there's a portrait of this guy as sort of a Kipling-esque tin pot despot, but he's not that way at all." And when we had this one particular, I think it was the first meeting, there were two things that were very interesting. One is Zia had a handicapped daughter, was very solicitous of her, which impressed Casey. And then he had this famous template speech, which he would put a template over the southern part of Afghanistan, and by way of demonstrating how close it was to the Indian Ocean and what the Soviet aim was. And of course, they were building up their base in the southern city there. What is it?
Kandahar?
No, farther south. Shindan, to the southwest. So Zia, he had this formula that he wanted this aid to go to the Mujahideen, but he didn't want it so much that the kettle would boil over and it would invite Soviet intervention, which he was very conscious of. So he said, you want to keep the pot hot, but you don't want to have it boil over. And that's, we sort of followed this guideline. And of course, the people in the Congress, not just Charlie Wilson, but others, they were, and of course the military wanted to get into the act. But for reasons of political sense and plausible denial, we held them back. There were some military co-optees who helped to train the Paks, who then trained the Afghans. We didn't directly train the Afghans, but otherwise we kept the military out of it because it would have just been open warfare. So,
did you have during that time period? Did you have any contact? I mean, the political agenda of a man like Brian Crozier is very interesting, and he's quite open with it. Right in his book, on page 5 of his book, he states right out in the open. He said that we always had trouble in Britain. The British had trouble with the Americans. He says because you had that constitution of yours, which guaranteed all kinds of things. He said it was an obstacle to really dealing with things in the open world. Liz, it's on. Sorry, never mind.
Well, that was not my experience. We were hand in glove with MI6. Met them quite often. I met them at their headquarters. They would come to the U.S. Michael Warner was one of the principals. I think he was my counterpart. It was a very intimate relationship.
Well, as I said, I'm interested in it, just simply in terms of how you dealt with some of the complexities of the political situation that were presenting you with a fait accompli. You had to deal with them on the ground. But as an example, he states on page 5 of his book, Free Agent,
I think I've met him.
the important document, okay, the Foreign Office at the time had diagnosed the Soviet challenge accurately and perceptively in a wide-ranging paper. The strategic aspects of British foreign policy prepared by the Foreign Office for the Chiefs of Staff and sent to them by the Permanent Undersecretary Sir Orm Sargent. This important document, dated October 1946, assumed that the U.S. would continue its policies of active intervention. The problems with the Americans were, one was the mercurial character of the American people, unduly swayed by sentiment and prejudice, rather than by reason, or even by their own long-term interests. Another reservation was the, quote, archaic American Constitution, which handicapped governments, sometimes to the point of impotence. So this is Brian Crozier.
Well, a distinction should be made between the British service, the intelligence service, and the American intelligence service. As I mentioned a while ago, the American intelligence service is independent of the Foreign Office, the State Department. In Britain, that is not the case. It is under the Foreign Commonwealth Office, MI6. So they have to be very much in step with the policymakers at the diplomatic level. So there's quite a difference.
The process is completely different in the way it operates.
But as far as the relationship goes, there's been a constant, you know about the Five Eyes, of course. The Anglo powers agree not to spy on each other, but it's informal. But it goes back to the British-American SIGINT Agreement of 1946, which was later extended to the other Anglo-Saxon powers. And so the relationship with MI6 has always been very thick between MI6 and the CIA, with one possible exception, which I don't really have a feel for, except I have a sort of a smell for, if you will, during the Suez Crisis, whether there was total SIGINT exchange between NSA and the British counterpart, GCHQ. There might have been some wobbliness there, but other than that, no clouds, no clouds. And the fact that you can't run operations against the British and vice versa is very significant. I was almost assigned to be Chief of Station London, which is an important position because you're part of a Joint Intelligence Committee, which is a Commonwealth thing, but you can't do independent operations. And at the last minute, it was shifted, and I went to be Chief of Station Paris. And of course, France is not part of the Five Eyes system, and this is very much a actuality at the moment, particularly as regards France and Germany, because why should New Zealand be part of the Five Eyes system and our close allies in Europe, Germany and France not? And I think this has become a burning issue now because of the whole scandal of the Snowden revelations and how they tapped Angela Merkel's portable telephone. And of course they tapped President Hollande's also. Of course the French and German reactions were very different. The French took it as a matter of course because they do the same thing to us, but the Germans didn't, and they have the Nazi and Stasi background, and there was a huge uproar. The Germans came to Washington to ask for a no-spy agreement, and the Americans refused it. Admiral Blair wanted to extend it to the French, but he wanted to put it in writing, which the White House didn't accept. It's never been in writing. The SIGINT agreement is in writing, but this informal agreement, the no-spy agreement, has never been in writing. And that's why President Obama, in my view, that's why President Obama can say and has said publicly, we have no actual no-spy agreement with any foreign country. It's informal.
So he's technically correct.
Anyway, I'm sorry to get off the track there.
No, that's fine. That's fine. As I said, I'm trying to see the place. I mean, as we started to talk about before, the idea that the relationship, just the de facto relationship between the United States between the CIA and the ISI is right off the bat going to be a problem for the Afghans. Okay?
Yes.
Politically, okay? Culturally, it's going to be a problem. Just as you said, culturally, this is an issue between the issue of the Five Eyes versus not bringing in France and not bringing in Germany, two of America's most important partners in this process in the West. That is obviously having ramifications now. I mean, Merkel and Hollande are in Moscow right now negotiating with this over the Ukrainian issue.
Mm-hmm.
So we are on the cusp of these situations creating changes. They're going to necessitate changes one way or the other, and there is even talk at this point of a German-American split over these issues, such as especially over the Ukraine, because it's right in their backyard. But
By the way, I wrote a blog recently, somewhat controversial. The title is "Germany is not a classic Western ally."
And what was the response to it?
Well, a German friend of mine was quite incensed about it.
Really?
But you know, we had 2 world wars in order to tame Germany. And there is, you're right, there's on the popular level, there's a lot of anti-Americanism in Germany today. It doesn't extend to the political class, but it's there in the populace. They don't want to, especially because of the Snowden and the phone tapping incidents, Snowden revelations.
Well, you've also got a substantial part of the population in the eastern part of Germany that still has an experience with being part of the Soviet Union.
That's right.
Just as Vladimir Putin has said that there was a tragedy that the Soviet Union collapsed as an organizational thing. So you still have a. Okay. Let's move on to the time period. Brzezinski at the National Security Council. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So we're back in the 1977-78 time period. Brzezinski's at the NSC working against SAL II, detente towards a confrontational foreign policy, intentionally pushing it. He works with the Shah of Iran. The Shah works with President Mohammed Daoud in Afghanistan and sends him Savak agents to crush the left.
Where does this come from?
We're looking at this from the outside. This is Selig Harrison. Selig Harrison was the Washington Post correspondent.
I know him well.
Member of Council on Foreign Relations.
Very pro-Indian.
He is very pro-Indian.
Yes.
Okay. You've also suggested, by the way, that it's time to move from Pakistan to India, haven't you? In one of your pieces?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. I don't want to talk about that now. According to Sig Harrison, in response to Savak's pressure in April 1978, the PDPA rises up and deposes Mohammed Daoud in a bloody coup. Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, was using Iran as a U.S. surrogate in the Persian Gulf. America's policeman. You've stated publicly in interviews that Brzezinski was the point man on Iran and Afghanistan. I read a lot about the 1978 Marxist coup, and it all points to Hafizullah Amin as the driving force. What is your assessment of Hafizullah Amin?
Hafizullah Amin, of course, he overthrew Taraki, as I mentioned, and I think he was more open toward the West than Taraki was. They were both from the Khalq faction of the Afghan Communist Party. I think the Soviets wrong-headedly became suspicious of Amin and overthrew him. They didn't have to do that. But they somehow were blinded by the fact that Amin at one point had a connection with the Asia Foundation. But he was not a Western agent in any sense, to my knowledge. Certainly not a CIA agent.
Well, that's what I'd like to bring up some evidence. Richard D. Mahoney wrote in a book, Getting Away with Murder, the true story behind the American Taliban, John Walker Lind. Quote, 2 interviews done for this book reveal Amin was an agent of Pakistan's military intelligence arm, the Inter-Services Intelligence ISI, and was secretly listed with the CIA as a covert American source, a CAS. I believe the C is for controlled, not covert. His sources are a confidential interview with a U.S. military attaché, Defense Intelligence Agency, who served in Afghanistan in the 1970s, and a confidential interview with a senior policymaker in the Carter administration. Amin has been called, I know, a CIA agent by many people, and it's been denied again and again. That doesn't mean he doesn't have relations with the CIA, however. As you said, he was part of the Asia Foundation, which was a CIA front operation. Amin admitted taking money from the CIA. In 1977, Mohammed Daoud had outright forbidden the U.S. Embassy to have contact with Afghan leftists. Question. Hypothetically, if Amin is working for the ISI, as Mahoney contends, he doesn't have to be a CIA agent.
That's correct. I don't know whether Amin had any relationship with the ISI. I've never heard of it. But certainly he was not a CIA agent, to my knowledge. I never accepted that idea.
Could he have been a CAS?
No.
No.
Controlled American source? No.
No. Not possible.
Who is Richard Mahoney? It's a very familiar
Richard
name.
Mahoney was, he's written a number of books. He was
Is he ex-CIA? I don't think
his
so.
father was the governor of Arizona. I believe he ran.
No,
for-
he's not ex-CIA, no.
No, he's not ex-CIA.
No. I would discount a lot of that.
You would.
And of course, he did reach out to other diplomats, Western diplomats. He may well have had an interview with the defense attaché or with the ambassador. I think he did have an interview with the ambassador. So he was reaching out diplomatically, but that doesn't mean he was an agent.
Sig Harrison claims he met with, when Adolph Dubs came to be an ambassador, that he met with him 14 times.
Sig did?
Sig Harrison actually met Amin and the ambassador, Adolph Dubs, in the summer of 1978. He was there. He came there after, let me get to this, okay? After the 1978 Marxist coup.
Yeah.
Events seem to fall into place. Rebel resistance breaks out immediately over Amin's outrageous education policies and his land reform program.
Wait a minute, Taraki's in charge at the beginning.
Well, he is, but Amin's his right-hand man. Amin's
Okay.
actually
All right.
making
Okay.
it happen.
All right.
Taraki is the figurehead in
Okay.
the pleasant old man. PDPA fractures along factional lines. Barbara Karmal's Pasham is Soviet-friendly but not particularly popular. Amin's party Kulk is more rural and popular but clearly more radical. U.S. Ambassador Newman, before 1972, who Ted Elliott replaced him in 1972, has written that he always viewed Kulk as a Maoist party. But there are specific Maoist factions that have been split with Kulk at the time of the coup: Setemi Meli and Shola Jawi, two factions. Days after the 1978 Marxist coup, Zbigniew Brzezinski visits Beijing and offers China a military alliance. According to Raymond Gartoff, he shares top-secret intelligence on SALT II negotiations and Soviet positions and offers the Chinese advice on the Marxist coup in Afghanistan and how to counter it. That's a quote from Gartoff.
Gartoff is a credible source.
Okay.
Definitely.
The Soviets are very upset when they find this out.
How do they find it out?
They found it out, I don't know. He doesn't state that, how they found it out. That's maybe, I'll have to look into that. That's a provocation, and the Soviets protest sharing classified information with the Chinese. On May 5th, William Boldler, Director of Bureau of Intelligence and Research at the State Department, cables Under Secretary of State Warren Christopher that the Shah had been building a military force to intervene in Afghanistan to circumvent further Soviet influence, but that he would not be using it because there was no popular support for Daoud after he was overthrown. This is all spring of 1978. Question. Ray Gartoff claims that Carter didn't intend for Brzezinski to sacrifice the ongoing relationship with the Soviets in order to further a relationship with China, but that's what he did. Didn't that put the CIA into a bind?
Well, of course, Brzezinski was he was the hawk in the cabinet. Vance was the dove. They differed over the Iran rescue operation in 1980, 79-80, and I don't think that necessarily Carter listened to everything that Brzezinski advocated. I don't know. That's my guess, because they were not on the same page in many ways. Carter was a near pacifist. I think Brzezinski was in favor of a stronger reaction against Ayatollah Khomeini. I was very much involved in that, the debate over what to do. And I think if it had been Reagan, who was the president at the time, things would have ended very differently. I don't think that this insult would have been tolerated for so long, with so much foot-dragging and so much shilly-shallying, that the rescue operation kept getting put off. They were trying to find a political settlement, which never came. They couldn't really get to Khomeini. There was no way of doing it. They were trying to get to the civilian element in the government, Beni Sadr and Qutbzadeh, and it failed. The mediation attempt failed, and I think, knowing Brzezinski, or knowing about Brzezinski, he can't have been in favor of it. And of course, when the rescue operation took place, Vance resigned. He wasn't in favor of it. So there was a struggle within the cabinet over not just the Iranian issue, but I think other issues as well.
Well, what kind of problems did that create for you? And that's got to cause some kind of issue about you putting people into dangerous situations.
Well, of course, we were very much involved with state. As I mentioned, we were in lockstep with state over this whole Iranian crisis, looking for ways to end it by negotiation, looking for ways to support other figures in Iran, such as Admiral Madani, trying various political moves that could change the situation in Iran. It didn't really cause us any pressure in Afghanistan. The issue in Afghanistan became this question of the use of American arms, and the CIA was hesitant about it because
But that was after the Soviet. Well, that was.
Yes, that was in the 80s. Yes.
That was in the 80s.
Yeah.
Okay. I want to set up. John K. Cooley. You know Cooley.
I know. I've met him. Yes.
Has an explosive quote in his 1999 book on Holy Wars. He says, in September 1978, Chinese intelligence, Daewoo operative Qiao Shi, proposed to the Shah a new alliance to thwart Soviet expansion, especially in neighboring Afghanistan. Agreement was reached to undertake a covert war in Afghanistan, apparently independent of CIA plans for the same country. Chinese agents began to move into position in Pakistan. Liaising with Pakistan's ISI was the Iranian ambassador in Islamabad, former head of SAVAK.
Well, of course, the Pakistani-Chinese relationship goes way back, and it's something that the Pakistanis prize, as we know. So that doesn't surprise me. It's news to me, but it doesn't surprise me.
Do you think that now he states that it was without, he said, without the independent of CIA plans for the same country. Do you think that Brzezinski, having advised this in his position, may have influenced that decision, or that relationship?
You mean they might have gotten the idea that they should establish a relationship over Afghanistan?
He might have encouraged that. Brzezinski was working with the Shah of Iran. He was working with Saddam.
I doubt it. Again, that's news to me. I don't think Brzezinski would make that kind of move without going to Carter. I mean, he was the president after all. I don't have a great feeling of confidence in Cooley, frankly. It's totally different from Gartoff. Gartoff is a reliable character. Cooley, I think, maybe a little bit fanciful. I don't know, but I just don't have that same feeling of reliability about Cooley that I have with somebody like Raymond Gartoff.
January 1979.
I don't know whether that should be in the documentary or not.
It's all right. It's all right.
I don't like to make personal comments.
No, I understand. In January 1979, Brzezinski's staff member, Thomas P. Thornton,
Yes.
visits Amin in Kabul and gives, quote, a negative assessment recommending any additional aid to Amin regime be cut off.
What's the date of this?
This is January of 1979.
Okay.
The Soviets report in January on the Chinese efforts that Beijing is actively organizing scattered groups of Afghan pro-Maoists in Pakistan. They're reporting, Soviet press is reporting this. Their Congress, quote, their Congress, which was held illegally in Herat, defined the overthrow of the government of the DRA as a program task. This referred to the Shola Jawid and Setemi Meli and other splinter groups. On February 2nd, 1979, the Washington Post reported that guerrillas were training in Pakistan to oust the Afghan government. And on February 14th, the Setemi Meli supposedly kidnapped Ambassador Adolf Dubs. I say supposedly because there's something missing from the kidnapping narrative on this. First of all, Dubs allows the Setemi Meli into the embassy car without a protest. He's taken to an indefensible room at the Kabul Hotel, exposed to the street and the roof of the Afghanistan Bank, where they all wait for a response from the U.S. Embassy. Dubs is an experienced diplomat. He's also been a soldier. He's a tough guy, and he knows how to take care of himself. If he felt that he was under threat, he would have followed different procedures. Amin's people learn of the plan, surround the hotel, storm the room, killing the ambassador and the supposed kidnappers, and destroy all the evidence. And then there's this. This is a research paper that was done at the intervention in Afghanistan in the fall of the time. It's transcribed by Norwegian Nobel Institute of Oslo, 1996. I'll show this to you in a second. Okay. It was attended by, from the United States side, Admiral Stansfield Turner, General William Odom, Dr. Marshall Schulman, Mark Garrison, former Deputy Chief, U.S. Embassy, Moscow, and Dr. Gary Sick, former NSC member. Okay? The Russian participants, USSR Ambassador to Washington, Dobrynin was there, Karen Butenz, former head CPSU, CC International Department, General Valentin Verenikov, former Deputy Minister of Defense and Chief of Ground Forces in the USSR General Staff, and others. The point I want to make here is that on page 80 of this document, General Blayakovsky makes the statement, then there was the episode where the American ambassador was killed. What were the circumstances? My account is based on my conversations with our secret services who are in charge of monitoring the crisis. One of the officers of the Secret Service told me that Dubs was seen in the company of those same people who kidnapped him later in the same hotel in the same room the day before they kidnapped him. And then later, Dubs was in his car with a travel case. He stopped his car when those same people whom he saw the day before ordered him to stop, as if they were known to him. You understand that we are talking about an ambassador with an armored car. Bulletproof windows, doors that can't be opened only from the inside. It has a siren that goes off in an emergency situation. Dubs did not use any of these emergency measures. He opened the door himself, let the people kidnap him in the car. They came to the hotel and demanded that their extremist friends who were in prison be released. And then Amin ordered the hotel to be stormed. Both the Americans and us pleaded with Amin not to storm the hotel. I can leave this with you.
Yeah, I'd like to look at that.
Take a look at that.
What's the date of this conference?
The date was September 17, 1995. The whole thing is online. It's hundreds of pages.
I have to say, I'm going to disappoint you because I didn't come on the scene until the middle of '79. I was in Jordan. So the Dubs incident, I don't have first-hand information about. I took over the Near East South Asia Division in July '79 and held it for 5 years until mid-'84 when I went to Paris.
Well, I guess my question would be then, do you have any recollection of any relationship of the United States, of the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, okay, with the Setemi Meli? There is a rumor that we heard that had happened was the U.S. Embassy had been supporting the Setemi-Meli long before the Dubs got there the previous summer.
How? How? Supporting them how?
Supporting them with money, apparently, with support.
There's
I
no-
said it's a rumor.
There's no finding.
I have no
The
no
finding came in
verification.
July '79. There was no finding before that. No funding. No finding. No funding. Period.
In opposition to Brzezinski's destabilization plan, Dubs was cutting off the Setem with a final payment. That's what we heard. It's a rumor.
Well, I mean, unless there was an Ollie North operating out of the White House at that time.
That's a possibility, isn't it?
Not really. Not under Brzezinski. Brzezinski isn't that kind of a guy. He wouldn't do something as unauthorized or unorthodox as that. There was no funding before July '79. It's that simple.
No secret funds, no secret slush funds, no.
You have to have a presidential finding in order to do anything outside of espionage. Any action that is taken abroad has to have a presidential finding. It doesn't apply to intelligence collection, but it does apply to any form of covert action, propaganda, funding, weapon supply, you name it. Any action has to have a presidential finding. And that's since the scandals of the 70s.
But you weren't aware of what Lyakovsky maintains,
No.
that he'd spoken, that Dubs had met with this group the day before in the same hotel room.
No, I'm not too familiar. The only thing I have in my mind about the Dubs incident was that the Soviets were involved in the rescue operation and it was botched. That's about what I know about the Dubs operation. Sorry about that, but I wasn't there.
There's a lot of stuff going on here, needless to say, during this time period, critical time period. Maoist Kalkis, KGB agents, Chinese intelligence, and the ISI all have a dog in the fight.
Quite possible.
Dubs was clearly an obstacle to a larger plan at this particular moment. Amin is the wild card. Hafizullah Amin is the wild card in this. Brzezinski laid all the blame on the Soviets for the death of the ambassador, but they clearly have nothing to gain and everything to lose, certainly. As you said, it was botched. Salt is dead, detente is dead. The Soviets are now delegitimized in Washington's eyes, and the U.S.-China relationship is guaranteed. On the other hand, the assassination puts U.S. policy into Brzezinski's hands from that moment on and brings the neoconservative Team B position to center stage. Back in the U.S., neoconservatives present the Dubs murder as an example of Soviet irredeemability, politically, and American weakness under Carter's presidency, which can only be resolved with a Reagan presidency. Question, is it possible Amin was serving one of these privatized foreign intelligence operations without the knowledge of the CIA, whose agenda was to trigger an event from which the Soviet Union and U.S. relationship could never recover, while leaving the CIA out of the loop?
I think it's highly doubtful. Highly doubtful. I think things don't happen that way. I just don't know about Amin as a political action operative. I don't know.
Amin and Taraki begin to ask for Soviet troops. During this time period, the East German Minister Counselor Hermann Schweitzow is acting as a back channel, keeping the U.S. Embassy informed of Soviet concerns about Amin. He explains the Soviets want to replace the PDPA with a broad-based coalition government and perhaps even bring back the king, but these messages are disregarded. The Soviets are still operating...
Who is the source of this?
I'm sorry?
Who is the source of this?
This is all coming from, this is Sig Harrison. Some of it's actually Gartov as well. Yeah.
Sig is a competent guy, no question about it.
From now on,
he has a prejudice, but he's a competent journalist.
his prejudice being he's pro-Indian.
He's pro-Indian, yeah.
Okay. The minutes of Politburo meetings reveal the Soviets don't know what's going on. A senior Soviet diplomat, Vasily Safranchuk, is sent down to keep an eye on Amin. He declares him to be, quote, a commonplace petty bourgeois and extreme Pashtun nationalist, a political schemer with boundless political ambitions and a craving for power. That's a quote.
That sounds
Sounds
right on, yeah.
Brzezinski is operating under, as I said, the Soviets are still operating under the assumption the U.S. is maintaining their acceptance of Afghanistan being within the Soviet sphere of influence. But Brzezinski is operating under a new and hostile agenda. Stansfield Turner would later say that if he had understood Soviet perceptions better, then he would have reacted very differently to their actions during that time period. But then how could he know better, since the State Department wasn't passing on the back channel information that was coming from Schweitzer? This is according to Sig Harrison.
Well, that's quite possible.
Question. Robert Gates said that it was early in 1979, even before Dubs was killed, that the debate had begun over giving the Soviets their own Vietnam.
Oh, wait a minute now. 79? Dubs
Early
is
in
killed
79.
Dubs is killed in 78.
No, Dubs is killed in February 14th, 1979.
Is that right?
The,
Oh, yeah, it's the Afghan.
April
It's 78
revolution
was
April
the
79.
yeah, okay.
78.
Yeah, 78. Okay, I'm sorry.
78,
Sorry for
right.
that.
So we've got 1 year, okay? Robert Gates stated it was early in 1979, even before Dubs was killed on February 14th, that the debate had begun over giving the Soviets their own Vietnam. And that's the way it's phrased in his book, giving them, what are the benefits of giving the Soviets their own Vietnam? And he commissioned a study. At what moment would you say the system gave in to Brzezinski's anti-Soviet agenda? Would it be following the death of Adolf Dubs?
Well, certainly that damaged the relationship between the U.S. and the Afghan Communist Party government. But I think that operationally it began at some point in the spring when Akhtar proposed aiding the Mujahideen, and obviously with Zia's approval. And then this resulted in the presidential finding of July 79, which launched the program. So I think it was, at the operational level, it was Akhtar and the station chief starting this. Now, obviously, the agency doesn't know the higher political dialogue that's going on. That's why that's why I said to Brzezinski what I said. Your evidence shows that there was a lot of thought being given to sucking the Soviets into Afghanistan.
But from your perspective, it was literally an operational.
Yeah, although
you didn't care one way or the other whether the United States stayed on a course of detente with the Russians or whether they.
Oh no, we were terribly gung ho to hit the Russians in Afghanistan, terribly, because of Vietnam. We wanted to make it a Vietnam. Oh yes, once the program started, we were terribly gung ho. More Soviets that killed, the better. In fact, Sig Harrison once accused me of wanting to fight to the last Afghan.
How did you feel about that?
I didn't care as long as we harmed the Soviets. Because there was that whole period in the late 70s when the Soviets seemed to be gaining ground everywhere in the Horn of Africa and Angola, and we were terribly frustrated. And then suddenly came this opportunity to hit them back in Afghanistan, and we gave it our all. Although people in the Congress might have said we didn't do enough, as in Charlie Wilson's war.
Well, we'll get to that in a moment. I'm getting down to my last couple of questions here. Amin and Taraki begin to ask for Soviet troops every time they ask. Now, there's an interesting thing happening, a dynamic here between Taraki and Amin and the Russians in Moscow. And you can read a lot of the background conversations online now. They're fascinating. Every time they ask, the Politburo votes no to Taraki and Amin's requests. They make some absurd requests for dressing up Soviet soldiers in Afghan uniforms. They're aware of the consequences, and especially because they don't trust Amin. And they state that very clearly.
Mm-hmm.
Taraki goes to the non-aligned conference in Havana in September of 1979 and stops off in Moscow on the way home. Brezhnev tells Taraki that Amin is the problem, and he should arrange for Amin to step down. Taraki goes back to Kabul, schemes to have him killed, which fails. Amin responds by having Taraki killed, and that's it. Brezhnev is personally insulted at the murder of Taraki and in revenge plots to remove Amin. We know that what happens from that point on.
Mm-hmm.
But not until the Kremlin hears rumors about Amin's plan to invite the Mujahideen into Kabul do they take final action. A report in the British Roundtable from April 1981 reports that, quote, in the Soviet perception, the risk of Amin doing a Sadat was increasing, and this would have meant Afghanistan going under Sino-Soviet influence, Sino-American influence.
Yeah.
This proposition became a reality in Soviet eyes when information was received in Moscow that Amin had made a deal with one of the dissident groups. This information came through party channels in Kabul, which was so alarmed that they forced Amin to issue an invitation, the 14th invitation for Soviet military assistance. Amin agreed to this request for two reasons. He felt a refusal to accept it would arouse the suspicion of the Russians. He also felt confident that, like other previous requests for direct military help, it would be turned down. He miscalculated on both counts. Moscow speeded up in response when it was realized that December 29 was the date set by Amin for dissidents to march on Kabul. Question: was this information being fed to the Soviets as part of your non-lethal propaganda campaign authorized by President Carter in the summer of 1979?
This is total news to me. I had no indication that Amin was in touch with the Mujahideen. Of course, I was back in Washington. I wasn't in the field. You probably have talked to the station chief at the time. I don't know whether you have or not.
No, I haven't talked to him. Who was the station chief
Well, I'm not sure.
in the station chief in Kabul?
I'm not sure who it was.
We can
I
find
can't
out.
remember, yeah. There was a succession of station chiefs. Howard Hart was one. Bill Pikney was another. Milt Bearden was, this is in sequence. Milt Bearden was at the end of it. You've talked to Milt Bearden.
This was in Pakistan, correct? Yes, this was in Pakistan, in Islamabad.
Yes, yes.
Well,
Well, when was Charles Dunbar in?
he was there in '83. I don't know when he
83.
came in.
Well, he's state, of course. He's not CIA. Chief in Afghanistan. It just escapes me.
George Griffin, by any chance?
I think he's state.
He's state.
Yeah. You might do well to find out who was the station chief and try to interview him, because I'm back in Washington. This is the fall of '79. All we know is that. In fact, I think we learned it after the fact, this connection between Amin and the Asia Foundation, but we didn't know much more than that.
Really?
Yeah.
So you weren't aware of his connections to?
To the Mujahideen, no.
No.
That's news to me.
Well, we spoke with a mullah, an Afghan mullah, that we had interviewed in 1981 in Kabul. He lives here now. He was close to Amin and the Soviets, both the Soviets. The Soviets, he told us the Soviets had a big picture of him in the Kremlin.
Of whom?
Of this particular mullah.
Oh, yeah.
He confirmed to us that Amin had made a deal brokered by the ISI with Gulbuddin Hekmatyar late in 1979.
Oh, that makes sense.
He knew him well. The mullah also expressed his anger that Amin had not been given the support he was promised and sold out by the United States.
The United States promised him aid?
He claimed that the United States had told him that they were backing him in what he was trying to do.
You mean with the Mujahideen?
With whatever program he was trying to get forward.
Maybe it was agricultural or something like that.
Well, I don't think in this particular case it was. They believed. We also heard from a BBC reporter who claimed that when Amin heard the helicopters coming to the Darul Aman Palace, he said, "Oh, the Americans are coming to save me." That's hearsay. That's just hearsay.
Well, it's the ISI and Gulbuddin, I think. That's a lash up, yeah.
That's real.
In fact, Akhtar used to sort of jibe us and say, saying, "Your friend Massoud." Because obviously Massoud was not a favorite of the ISI. The ISI was into Gulbuddin. And, well, as I've said in that article, the CIA in Afghanistan since 1979, we had a sliding scale of aid to the Mujahideen groups that went from, at the top, Gulbuddin and Massoud, and working down the line, Yunus Khalis, Sayyaf, and down to the royalists who got very little. And this was worked out with Akhtar. It was a gentleman's agreement. It was very hard for us to follow up and monitor it. We tried, but it was not easy.
So the real effort was just simply to destabilize the regime and not to really help the Afghans replace the government with some kind of to help them stabilize.
The whole effort was to kill Soviets.
That was it.
Yeah.
Plain and simple.
Yeah.
Okay. So there was
And
never,
make it their Vietnam.
all right.
And it turned out it was a one-quarter Vietnam. 14,000 killed against 58,000 Americans in Vietnam.
But they had a much smaller contingent there.
100,000.
Yeah, 100,000.
Yeah.
So percentage-wise, it's a similar.
Yeah. And they were hurting, as you pointed out, this typhoid and
Right. Yes.
what was the other thing?
Drug addiction.
Drug addiction, yes.
Okay, last couple of questions. Soviets are in Afghanistan. First of all, Politburo transcripts revealed what Brzezinski and Team B neocons like Richard Pipes were saying about Soviet plans for using the invasion as a platform for taking the Persian Gulf. They're not backed up by the facts. If you look at what the Soviets were saying to themselves during that time period and trying to figure out what the game was in Afghanistan, okay, their goal was to get in and out of Afghanistan as quickly as possible. That was the.
Why did they build up these bases then, in Shindad?
I don't think there
in Herat.
was. I think that from our perspective, I think that there was. We tend to look, or the United States tends to look at these things as monolithic. If you look into the discussions, the hijinks that were going on between the KGB and the GRU, as an example, the military intelligence operations. The GRU was supporting Amin pretty much right up to the very end.
Uh-huh.
They were against Moscow replacing him.
Yeah.
And it was Andropov at the KGB who finally came around and said, yeah, we got to get rid of this guy, he's got to go. So that's the only way that I can explain why. But we went to Nightline. And now, okay, we went to Nightline with Roger Fisher at the Harvard Negotiation Project in 1983. Stanislav Gavrila came down from Moscow to meet Roger at the Soviet embassy and told him point blank, Roger, we make mistakes, but we're not stupid. Go back to Washington and tell them we want to get out. Just let us save face, stop the insurgency, and we'll leave. And that was in April of 1983.
Easier said than done.
John McMahon, CIA director, deputy CIA director, wanted a diplomatic solution. He pushed for the Afghan aid program from the beginning, but objected that there was no foreign policy to back it up. He wrote, quote,
Where did he write this?
he wrote this in Sig Harrison's book,
Okay.
out of Afghanistan. If a covert action is not based in foreign policy objectives, it's pure fun and games. It's no basis for achieving anything. And then shortly thereafter, in comes Charlie Wilson, and the fun and games begin.
He said, this is all quoting McMahon.
No, I'm saying, his quote ends with, it's no basis for achieving anything. End of quote.
That sounds like McMahon. I have the greatest respect for him. Is he still alive, by the way?
I believe he is, yeah.
He's out in California.
I'd like to speak with him.
I was very closely connected with him.
Okay. And then shortly thereafter, in comes Charlie Wilson and the fun and games begin. We've spoken to many audiences since our books have come out about Charlie Wilson's war, including the naval postgraduates.
It wasn't his war.
And try to explain that it wasn't what it appeared to be. That's what we do. We've gone around and said Charlie Wilson's war wasn't what Charlie Wilson says it was.
That's correct.
But it's become such a powerful, triumphalist American narrative of the Cold War. Mm-hmm. It's still persuading America's leadership to continue arming insurgencies without factoring in the evidence of what they actually lead to. Cheryl Bernard, CIA Rand Corporation expert on political Islam, who's married to Zalmi Khalilzad, stated in a 2004 interview, "In Afghanistan, we made a deliberate choice. At first, everyone thought there's no way to beat the Soviets. So what we have to do is throw the worst crazies against them that we can find, and then there was a lot of collateral damage. We knew exactly who these people were and what their organizations were like, and we didn't care. Then we allowed them to get rid of, just kill all the moderate leaders. The reason we didn't have any moderate leaders in Afghanistan today is because we let the nuts kill them all. They killed the leftists, the moderates, the middle of the roaders. They were just eliminated during the 1980s and afterwards." Question: the real outcome of Charlie Wilson's war is the belief that empowering radical and other insurgents is a legitimate form of foreign policy. In fact, it isn't really a policy at all. That's the true legacy of Charlie Wilson's war, and as a final statement, we'd like you to comment on that.
Well, in the first place, of course, it wasn't Charlie Wilson's war. Charlie Wilson was effective, among other congressmen, McCollum and others, in pushing the Stinger program, which the CIA was initially reluctant to do because of the plausible denial question. The Stingers were effective, yes, but it wasn't his war. We did the war. That is, the CIA and General Akhtar, and later General Gould, who turned against us. But at any rate, it was a joint Pakistani-American operation, and Charlie Wilson's role was important, but it wasn't overwhelming by any means, and it's not his war. And he had some problems of his own. He tried to promote this Ehrlichon gun, which was very expensive, and I think there was some suspicion that he had a financial interest in it, or I don't know. He's dead now. He was a very strange character. He looked very much like a Texan, except for a huge potbelly. Otherwise, he was very lean and rangy and everything else. He had a bevy of women as his assistants. He obviously had a reputation as a womanizer. He had this Texan bankroller woman. Anyway, it's all in the film. I didn't see the film. I won't see the film. I won't read the book, although I was interviewed for the book by the author, George Cryle, who's also dead. R.I.P. to both of them.
Have you read his book?
No.
You haven't read his book yet?
I won't read it. No. He developed a hostility, shall we say, to me. It's sort of the Boston, Texas contradiction, if you will. And he took an aversion, I think, to me. I was too, cultivated or whatever. And of course, there was a guy in the service who went around our backs and convinced Charlie that we weren't doing enough, which we were doing everything we could, and that's, of course, also R.I.P., Gus Debricados. Anyway.
So did you get along with Gus?
Obviously not.
Not at all. No.
He was frustrated. I think he was on the margins of all this. I mean, the people who were running it was myself, John McGaffin, my deputy for Asia, South Asia, and others, Frank Anderson, who later became chief Near East, Howard Hart out in the field, Bill Pikney out in the field, Milt Bearden out in the field doing a very good job. So these are the people who were running the place. It wasn't Charlie Wilson's war at all. But that's the mythology.
That's the mythology. I started to tell you before. We went back to talk to Roger Fisher.
Uh-huh.
Okay, after 9/11, and asked him the question, what would you say to Gavrilov now if you knew then what you know now? Roger said, I'd tell him to save his ass now and his face later. So many words.
It's good.
If you knew then, if you knew in 1982, 1983, 1984, what you know now, what would you have done differently to challenge Charlie Wilson from taking over this publicity campaign against the Soviet Union? That's my final question to you.
Oh, I thought that was a question to Roger Fisher.
Oh, no, I asked Roger Fisher. I'm asking you the same question. I asked Roger that, and his answer was, I would tell Gavrilov to save his face later and his ass now. What would you say to Charlie? What would you say? What would you have done differently if you had a chance? If you went back to 1982, 1983, during the time your tenure as the chief of the Directorate of Operations, what would you
Chief
do?
Near East operations.
Near East operations.
Yeah.
What would you do differently today than what you did?
Well, it's a difficult question because the main aim of the Afghan covert action operation was to get the Soviets out, and it was successful. Now, there has been some blowback, obviously. I mean, Haqqani, who's active today, Gulbuddin, who's active today, are there. And Haqqani has been very active against the Americans. So there's a certain amount of unwelcome results. But overall, I don't think we could have done it any differently.
You don't?
No.
You don't think that perhaps being more concerned about involving moderate Afghans would have made it easier in the long run to get a better solution?
Well, Massoud was murdered 3 days before 9/11. Massoud was our, quote, white hope, and that of the British. We placed a lot of stock in Massoud. And of course, out of Massoud came the Northern Alliance, which was very much of a factor in routing the Taliban after 9/11. So we did have contact with some moderates. It wasn't just the extremists, but they did later take over because Massoud went out of the picture. And today, Haqqani and Gulbuddin are prominent in the Afghan Taliban, or supporting them, rather. I mean, they're not part of the Taliban, but they support it. And they're a thorn in the side of Americans. So there's been some unwanted effects. In fact, I did an article recently with John McGaffin, who's an advisor to Homeland, and it was an article in the Daily Beast on Homeland, and we go into some of this rumination about what happened. Not all of it good as a result of the Afghan covert action operation, but I don't think it could have been done any other way. If you involved the American military, if you tried to aid the Mujahideen unilaterally through parachute drops, it is fantasy. You had to do it through the ISI. So I don't have regrets. I mean, it did hasten the fall of the Soviet Empire. It's part of the reason. Some people disagree with it, but I don't. I think it was a factor. And there was a large element of discontent in the Soviet population, the mothers and so forth, about this, what was happening to their boys. And I think it was a factor in the end of the Cold War, which was very desirable. Now we have a sort of a Cold War redux, but that's another story.
That's another story. I think that will do it for today.
Okay.
Mr. Cogan. Dr. Cogan, thank you very much for...
Well, I hope it was useful. I sort of had fun with it, actually.
Good.
You're a good interviewer.
I'm sorry?
You're a good interviewer.
Well, thank you very much.
Can I propose, let's just sit quietly for 30 seconds so I can get room tone. This is room tone. Quiet, please. And room tone. Thank you very much.